Thalia, the blooming one, is the muse of comedy and Bucolic poetry. Like each of her 9 sisters, she was worshipped by archaic Thraco-Boeotian poets, eventually all of archaic Greece, as a goddess of music, art, and literature in general. In the later classical period of Greece, each of the 9 muses were associated with different and specific poetic, literary, or artistic genres. Thalia is the first of the 9 muses we've discussed, whom the Greeks associate with 2 genres, comedy and Bucolic poetry. Bucolic poetry is also referred to as pastoral poetry. Pastoral poetry is verse that tells the stories of humble shepherds living in the Greek mountains, of farmers and woodsmen, and all manner of rural men and women, their small local adventures, their loves and lives in their sylvan realms, their dreams and daily joys, and their relationship with the natural world around them. Pastoral poetry idealizes country life, while often overlooking the hardships that come with it. Bucolic poetry celebrates the small people working the land, and pines with nostalgia for a time before cities, before empires, back when everything was simple, communities had roots, and the entire world was green and living. This genre is a beautiful Greek tradition that later writers would attribute to Theocritus of Syracuse, a bard in the court of Ptolemy in Alexandria. This Greek tradition became a broader European tradition, continuing all the way up to modern English Romanticism, and remains a prominent part of European literature today. We see the pastoral aesthetic in parts of modern fantasy, in particular in Tolkien's descriptions of the Shire. Thalia, then, is the muse of green places, of growing things, which fits her name perfectly, as one may translate her name as blooming, growing, abundant, or most eloquently, the blooming one. Comedy is Thalia's other genre, which in the classical period was a witty and whimsical form of musical theater. Classical Greek comedy began with a song number, sang by an imaginative chorus of colorful characters. Professionally trained singers and dancers would put on the costumes of giant creatures like great wasps or frogs, or even more bizarre characters like singing clouds or even kitchen utensils. Classical comedy played with strong elements of farcical absurdity, irony, and satire, parodying many aspects of Athenian city life. Very few subjects were off limits. Comedians were free to ridicule leaders of the state, well-known philosophers, and even many of the gods. The only subjects that were off limits were the higher gods, such as Athena, goddess of wisdom and the divine guardian of Athens, and Zeus, the heavenly father of gods and men. However, lower-ranking gods and demigods, and many other subjects of classical Greek poetry were fair game. Heracles, for example, was a common character in the comedies of Aristophanes. Heracles was often portrayed in the comic genre as a simple-minded strong man with a good heart, with a boundless appetite, always eager for the next meal. Even Dionysus, the divine patron of the theater, was featured in some comedic plays. He stars in the play The Frogs, in which he journeys into the underworld in search of a real poet, a truly skilled playwright of old, unlike all the talentless hacks of the modern scene. Classical comedy was quite distinct to classical Athenian culture, though it was influenced by more ancient Greek comedy, which oddly enough would be even more relatable today than the more refined art of the Athenians. The most ancient of Greek comedy is the most similar to the widespread low-brow humor that seems to be a universal part of the human experience. Lots of jokes about the body parts and body noises, silly, ribald tales, and raunchy short poems. That was archaic Greek comedy, and a bit of it inevitably made it into the more sophisticated, elaborate, and whimsical works of classical Athenian comedy. Comedy always seems to have been the genre that plays to the common man. While the more subtle satire and comedic irony may play to the Athenian aristocrat, there was always a good bit of phallic humor thrown in for the plebs. Thus, we begin to see a connection between Thalia's 2 distinct genres. The Bucolic poem celebrates the common man, while the comedy plays to his tastes. The shared spirit of comedy and Bucolic poetry goes deeper, though, as we see comedy and pastoral are easily combined together. One of my favorite plays by Aristophanes is The Birds, and like all of his plays, it is named after the chorus, a whole troop of singing birds. Each of the birds is a different species. each with their own elaborate costume and mask in the original classical productions. These birds are tricked to attend a council by the two protagonists of the play, two Athenian men, Pythagoras and Euripides, who are tired of city life. So they go and they find a man who has somehow transformed into a hoopoe to summon the birds of the world to a council so they can negotiate the establishment of a new city, a city run by birds in the sky. And this city, as it turns out, ends up being so exceptionally well run. The birds are so good at managing a city, they end up acquiring power across the entire cosmos. In the birds, we see a number of pastoral motifs mixed with comedy. The birds are superior statesmen compared to humans and even gods, so we have a biting mockery of city life. At the same time, the two main human characters long for a simpler life away from the city, even if that's not quite what they get in the end. In the play, Aristophanes romanticizes and idealizes creatures of nature and life outside the city in a kind of fantastical version of country life in the sky. The birds foreshadows many elements of what would later be referred to as pastoral poetry. One might say the Bucolic poem is something that develops from comedy, or at least emerges from a common source, in the same way that many consider comedy to be a more light-hearted evolution of tragedy. This brings us back to the Muse. In classical art, Thalia is depicted as a serene and contemplative woman, holding two items that symbolize her dual talents. In one hand, she carries the iconic comedy mask, and in the other, she holds the shepherd's staff of Bucolic poetry. Thalia frequently wears an ivy crown, suggesting a special connection to the god Dionysus. This ivy crown is a twofold symbol. Dionysus is the god of wine and god of the vine, the god of wild nature, so his imagery suggests the rural and sylvan subjects of Bucolic poetry. At the same time, Dionysus is the god of theater, and comedy is one of the two major genres of Athenian drama. The ivy crown upon the muse's head, the abode of the soul that controls the body, suggests a single mind and spiritual consciousness behind both of Thalia's interests. From the single mind of the muse spring both of these genres, two art forms flowing from the same creative source. Further meanings of Thalia's name hold additional clues. Her name means sprouting, blooming, and abundance. Her name also means festivity or festive spirit. Thalia shares her name with one of the Graces. The Graces are daughters of Zeus and Eurynome, and they are goddesses of festivity. Thalia of the Graces, sister of Thalia the Muse, is a daughter of joyful feasts and festive banquets. A festive meal with beloved kith and kin is one of life's simplest yet most reliable of pleasures. This same meaning is a connotation the Muse shares with her half-sister, festivity and enjoyment of life's pleasures. This is the common essence of Bucolic poetry and comedy. Bucolic poetry idealizes the humblest ways of life and looks for the good in little things. Bucolic poetry romanticizes and celebrates the natural world. Comedy encourages us to laugh at life's absurdities and ironies, to laugh at life in general, the good and the bad. Both genres encourage a festive spirit that helps the soul itself bloom. If you are blessed with a good sense of humor and a pure heart that enjoys simple things, you are likely to live a very happy, long, and fulfilling life.